What is up, everybody? Welcome to the first episode of the Hot Zone podcast. I'm XSS Gaming, your host. I'm so excited to have the first episode out for you guys. Um, Basically, this podcast is going to be kind of a variety of different things. So we're going to talk politics, we're going to talk gaming, we're going to talk religion, and everything in between. And we're really going to be open and honest in this podcast and really talk to each other and have a really good discussion back and forth with you guys. So, if you guys ever have questions for these podcasts, I'm going to try to announce the topic of the podcast the Monday before, so the beginning of the week. So basically, every episode uploads on a Sunday, and then the next day, the next episode's topic will be announced, and then you guys throughout the week can go on Discord, and you guys can leave your questions or ideas or anything down below. So, this week's episode was supposed to be about Black Ops 6, but I decided to do it about the book that I'm currently writing because BO6 is coming out here on the 25th, and then pretty much I think the same weekend as that is the next episode. So I figured that episode should be more about BO6, especially so that I can talk about how I'm feeling about the game, etc. So this week we're going to talk about my book. And we're gonna just go over why I wrote it, what it's about, etc. So I hope you guys are ready for that. These episodes will be about 50 to 55 minutes long because that's the limit I can do on a PlayStation. If anyone out there wants to be a co-host in any way or be a part of the show as a guest, I will have the application in the link tree down below in the comments of this video. So make sure you check that out. Without further ado, let's hop into it. So I created the world for the War for the World Survival back in 2019-ish, 2020, and so I've been working on it for a few years. The first few years that I was working on it, I wasn't writing a whole lot of stuff. I was kind of just thinking about ideas, kind of getting what I wanted down with how I wanted to lay out the book. Because that's a big thing for when you're writing a book, right? It's like you just never know how you want to kind of lay it out. And so, like, I didn't know if I was going to do main characters or if I was going to do a more mental look at the book or not. But or if I wanted to do like a more of a first person encounter instead of a third person encounter, etc. So then in 2022, I think it was, I began writing the book. At the current moment, as we are sitting here today, um, I'm sitting at like 40,000 words, I think it is. Let me just pull it up. And so when I created the book, I wanted to tell a story of human suffering, but in a hopeful way, right? Because for me, that's always been my my enjoyable thing when it comes to movies or books, right? I always love watching the human element in situations, right? Like human element in history, for example, with wars, right? You have like World War One and Two, and the Civil War, and the Revolution, and the French Revolution, etc. And you get to see so many different people throughout so many different time periods struggling with so many different things, and it's the idea that you can persevere through those things and can come out the other side better and better than ever before, right? And that was something I was fascinated with when I started writing the book. And I wanted to really focus on the global aspect of things, not just on one person. So my book is actually doesn't have hardly any main characters, and if I do have main characters, they're only for about a chapter or so long. Then they kind of go away because I feel like main characters wouldn't they probably would help readers connect individually, but I feel like it kind of would pull away from the fact that this is a book that's covering hundreds of years and is spanning life generations. Like, we're not talking about a book that's covering a couple battles and the politics or something. We're talking about a book that is covering um, multiple generations long for people and their family trees, and talking about multiple periods in within this war and kind of going into depth in those periods, and that's kind of the goal. So when I created the book, I was kind of in a dark place. I would say I was kind of more depressed, and so the beginning of the book, I made it more depressing than I would say that is now. Um, as the chapters have gone on, and as I've progressed in real life as well, you can tell that the book has gotten a little bit more jolly in the sense that there's not as much loss as there was in the beginning. And so, what I mean by that is, in the beginning, a lot of the battles that I focused on were bad in the sense of there was the death and the sadness rate was extremely high. But looking back on it now, I can honestly say that that was probably the best decision I've made with the book, because I think what a lot of these alien movies and alien stories, because I'm a huge sci-fi fan. I love sci-fi movies. I love the idea of aliens in general. This idea, right, of another species from another planet. And when I wrote and start thinking about the story, my biggest problem was is how do I make it realistic, right? Because a lot of movies and stories struggle in terms of how do you make it so that the humans can obviously win, but it's not like so beyond easy that it's unrealistic, right? Because if you think about it, if you're an alien species enough to travel through space-time and go through wormholes and all this craziness, right? You would assume that they know how to take out a species relatively easily, right? I mean, that just would seem to be the common sense things. And so I found it hard to balance that. And then I got really, when I watched one of the movies, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, Battle Los Angeles, has Aaron Eckhart in it. And it's about a group of Marines who are fighting in Los Angeles against an alien species that came to invade. Now, these alien species invaded all around the globe. They landed in a bunch of different places in the movie, but the movie mainly focuses in Los Angeles, right? That's its main focus point. And I thought they did a really good job of balancing the aliens in that movie. Like, they did a fantastic job with it. And so, like, the aliens are very strong, and they're very they're very strong, and they're very anti-bullet resistant. Like, they take a lot of rounds to kill. They're not super easy, but they also have an extremely large weakness, which is their home base is a huge weakness. I mean, a few Marines were able to get inside the main base and destroy it, and I think that's a really interesting concept. Now, from my understanding is that movie takes place at a time where the aliens are, I think, weak, or have basically been fleeing their home or something. That was what caused them to be so weak on Earth. And I think that's a really interesting concept, and I think that's kind of why I went with that kind of weak concept in my book. And so, in my book, I named the aliens Exil. I wanted something super easy to say, something easy to remember. So I named it Exil. It's Xil, very, very simple, 3 letters. And so, when I made the Exil up, I wanted them to have a reason to fight not only the Earthlings, but also to fight for their own survival, right? And so I decided to do a hidden war within their own universe. So the Exil come from the Virgo galaxy, the Virgo A galaxy, which I believe is like 80 million light years or something away. And in their galaxy, right, they're under extreme pressure because they're losing a war, right? They're losing really quickly, quite in fact, a war against other species of aliens that have also come to invade them as well. And so, because of this, they begin looking for other planets or even other galaxies to go to try to survive this war. It's kind of like this weird, like, jumping pattern, right? Because you have the Exil fighting the humans on Earth and in the Milky Way galaxy, but then you have them also being fought and attacked by another species of aliens in their home galaxy. And that species of aliens is far, far superior in comparison to the Exil. We're talking about a species that has like Star Destroyers type ships that can destroy whole planets within a few seconds. So they're far, far superior in terms of technology. And I think that's something I want to talk more about in the future of the series that I'm developing, because I think that's a really interesting concept, maybe even having those species intertwine with the humans at some point. I have touched on it a little bit. I think in about chapter 20 or so, I think the humans do find out about this other species that they're fighting. And there's a couple times where that species has come to the Milky Way galaxy to help in certain situations, but never nothing serious, right? Nothing like monumental, like bringing a Star Destroyer or something and helping there. But I think it'd be a very interesting concept to bring that in, I guess, to kind of tie it all in together. But the Exil are weakened in that sense, that they're coming. The forces that are the troops and infantry and ships and weaponry that the Exil are bringing to fight against humanity are the weakest of the troops in terms of how powerful they are. Right, the high supreme troops, the best of the best, are all currently fighting the other species back in the Exil home galaxy. And I think that's a good way to balance it for right now, because as this book's going on, Earth is getting more technologically advanced. We're getting intercontinental space fighters. We're getting intercontinental space ballistic missiles, and so we're getting the Earth's getting very more technologically advanced. We're getting DNA based weaponry, looking laser rifles. Things are progressing extremely fast on human side because of the introduction of the Exil, right? Because these battles that are happening between Earth and the Exil, they're not just causing death and carnage for both sides, but what's also happening is the Earth troops like the EDF, which is the Earth Defense Force, they're able to acquire a lot of the gear that the Exil infantry is losing in these battles. And kind of rework it to the human technology. And I think it's really cool to see the progression of these things. So when I decided to do an alien space book, my biggest concern was to get bland. You see this a lot with a lot of other space movies. As the series goes on, they kind of just feel kind of whatever, right? Like Star Wars or even Star Trek or any of those movies, they kind of, after you watch like 5 or 6 movies of them, you're kind of like, all right, bro, we get it. And so I think that's why for me it was so important to keep making the notches go up, right? Like keep increasing them. And so what I've done is basically increase the carnage in each battle as I've gone through. Now there may be more hope in these battles, and the outcomes have maybe given more hope to the civilization, but the actual numbers have increased. And so it used to be a couple 100 million casualties for a battle was pretty standard in my story, and now we're getting into the billions, right? We're getting into those super high amounts, right? And as Earth's progressing through this war, our population has gone up and down drastically. After the initial invasion in the 2040s, the population went from like 9 million to 10 billion, down to like 2 or 3 billion. Okay, and then now in the story, we're looking at maybe 11 to 12 billion population because of the population spurts. Especially after the EDF took full control of the world other than the United States, the EDF has had a pretty big hand in forcing a lot of the next generation being born, right? They've basically instituted a forced birth generation, which is something that I was not wanting to do because it brings up an interesting idea, but I think it was a vital idea that and in a time of a war that I think takes up a lot of space and time for a civilization. This is not just a 2040 civilization. We're talking about from the 2040s, and I think right now in the book I'm at 2100 something. I think it is, and so there's a lot of information there's a lot of stuff. I shouldn't say information. There's a lot of stuff happening, and a lot of death in between these decades. Right? We're talking about a war where you could have went in the war at 18 or 19 during the 2040s, and you would be a general like in your 40s or 50s, and have kids who are in their early to late 20s that are also in the war, right? And so this is a multi-generational thing, and so the population is such an important feature of this story, and I think that is going forward, going to be my focus point is trying to bring in what it's like to be on the front lines. That's my biggest thing too. Is I really want to make sure people understand what it's like to be on the front lines. Right. This isn't a thing where like one of those romance movies where the guy is a military guy and he goes to war, and you see like a 5 second clip of him getting hit by an IED, and he goes home and has, you know, PTSD, and then cures it and gets a girl and marries, and that's the end of the movie. This is I want to focus this book on the aspect of they're in hell, right? They're suffering through hell, and then when they come home, there is no escape because home is now a war zone as well. Um, One movie I just watched recently, again for something I haven't watched in a really long time, was Edge of Tomorrow with Emily Blunt and Tom Cruise. And one of the things, the scenes they showed in the movie that I thought was eerily similar to how I describe the homeland of Earth, the places that are away from the front lines, was the scenes in like London, right, where it's just decked out in military gear. There's hardly any civilians walking around the city streets. There's curfews, and that's kind of how it is in my book as well. I mean, there's curfews up. There's not a whole lot to do. I mean, there's movie theaters and there's being movies being shown. There's colleges, there's schools, there's you know, all these things are still there, but there's nothing new, right? You're not seeing new movies being made. You're not seeing new TV shows being made. Not a whole lot of new music is being made because there's not a lot of time and effort for those things, right? Those things become put in the back burner while this war is being fought, and you see entire generations being born and lived and dying in a time where there is no new music, no new movies, no new TV shows, etc. Right? You're talking about a generation that, if you were born in the 2040s or 50s, you are probably the last generation to see a lot of new content when it comes to entertainment for quite a long time, until Earth really comes to get used to this and is able to take the time and kind of focus on that. So, kind of go into the backstory of the book that I'm writing. So for people that don't know, if they're not caught up, I do have a series on YouTube that I focus on it. But if you're not caught up, Wolf for the World Survival is a book about an alien invasion, obviously. And during the 2040s and right before the 2040s and the 2030s, the world has actually found peace for the most part. All of the Middle East is completely modernized and it has become a first world country, coming up just next to like the UK and stuff when it comes to how financially stable it is and how stable as a continent it is as a country. And so with the rebirth of the Middle East and terrorism kind of going away after some special forces strikes from the United States that was able to kind of wipe out terrorism as a whole. But even though the like terrorism and all that was kind of on the low, and war as a whole is on the low. So really wasn't no world wars. There was no small like nationwide wars. There was a few civil war type things happening, but nothing really serious. The other side of it, though, there was some unfortunate things happening. That being, the population was growing so fast compared to the population that the Earth could withstand at a given point. And then there was also the climate as a whole was in the worst state it's ever been in. We're talking about mass wildfires, mass hurricanes, larger tornadoes than ever recorded before. We're talking about E6, E7, E9 tornadoes, things that are not even imaginable now that are happening. We're seeing higher water levels on the coasts. We're seeing we're seeing large amounts of plagues and epidemics swiping things like places like Africa and Indonesia and Brazil. And so a lot of things are happening at this point, right? And so by the time the Exil attacked in 2040 and 2041, the Earth is struggling right now. It is struggling to withstand itself before it implodes. And that's kind of where the story begins. The story kind of begins after the events of 2040 and kind of picks up in 41, kind of going into the initial assault that would happen in Great Britain as well as in Russia. So that's kind of the backstory, kind of the premise of the initial beginning of the war. Now, For the next few minutes, for the pretty much the rest of this podcast, I kind of want to go into depth into some of the military engagements that happened in this war, in this book. So, the biggest thing for the EDF and for the American forces is the amount of infantry they had, right? So the things like tanks, vehicles, they weren't really all that useful for combat. The Exil had high-powered, high-skill-trained artillery as well as air support. And so bringing vehicles onto the battlefield really weren't all that helpful. It was easier to outfit a squad of men with everything they could possibly need to take out an enemy unit and have air support than it was to bring in like Abrams or Bradleys, because they were big, heavy, and they required a lot of resources to operate. So tanks and vehicles really stayed at the main front of home bases, so places like in like Washington D.C., and you're going to see this a lot in the later part of the story, where you're going to go to places like that are more center stage, that will have more vehicles and more equipment that will be used to defend those locations. Now, the way the military command was set up for the EDF and the US was kind of weird. So the EDF was the supreme leadership of Earth, right? They were the supreme leadership, right? Think of it as the Jedi of my story, right? They are the Jedi of my story. They are the focal point. They are what everyone wants to be, right? Everyone wants to be a part of the EDF. Everyone's fighting to be in control of the EDF and all these things, right? Because they're the main focal point. But the United States is not by any means weak at this point. The U.S. is the only country on the planet that is still standing by itself. The U.S. and EDF are allies, but they are by no means the same thing. The EDF does have troops stationed on the United States. Actually, majority of the battles that would be fought in the United States are actually defended or lost because of EDF infantry. The U.S. military at this point is really just focused on SEAL teams, getting special forces. They have like some of the best pilots in the military and on the planet. The U.S. Navy is probably the strongest thing within the United States right now, currently in this book. The U.S. Navy is still, if not stronger than it is now. They have tons more of aircraft carriers. We're talking about hundreds of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, hundreds of battleships, because the Exil really rarely ever fight anything on the ocean. It's kind of weird, and it's something I haven't touched on, but I kind of want to, because it's kind of weird in the story that the Exil have never touched really ships. It's very rare to see an Exil fighter or any Exil infantry attack a battleship or a cruiser or an aircraft carrier. And besides this, the U.S. takes advantage of this, and they just swamp the oceans with carriers, to the point where a lot of the presidential delegate and the Congress and all that are all usually stationed on ships in the Atlantic and the Pacific, because they're safer there than on land. Throughout the story, DC would be attacked, New York would be attacked, we would have battles in Florida, Miami, Los Angeles, Washington State, like Seattle, places like Detroit, Michigan, and other places along the United States, like Texas. We have like battles in Houston, battles along the coast of California, etc. Like, there's just so many places in the United States is being attacked throughout the story, and usually the U.S. and the UDF usually win these battles at the cost of extremely large amount of lives. Places like the line near the Mexican-American border, where we would see a bunch of airborne guys get completely wiped out in the defense of the border. But they would win the battle by defending the border long enough for the EDF and U.S. forces to acquire a defensive perimeter in that location. And this is becoming a recurrent thing, right, in the United States. But what about the European theater, right? Because the European theater is probably the most violent of the theaters. Europe was struck first in the initial assault by the Exil in 2041. They were the focal point of the Exil's landing strip. That is the largest landmass on planet Earth. I mean, you have all of Russia, all of the Europe countries like France, Germany, all that together. And then you also have Asia, and the Asian continents as well. And then you have Africa basically attached to the European continent. Even though it's a different continent, Africa is relatively close in terms of if you're coming to Earth and you're looking at Earth, they're all kind of close together, right? They're all kind of real tight. And so the Exile focused a lot of their efforts there because they assumed that majority of the human race would be in the largest land grab, right? And so Europe got hit hard. Places like Berlin, Paris, Britain, Moscow, these are all cities and countries that all got annihilated instantaneously. This is where those billions and billions of deaths to world populations would be most prevalent in the early stages of the war. A lot of people would try to come from the European continent to the United States, and this is going to lead to one of the former presidents of the EDF story about how he came to power, going from I think it was Germany. I wrote in the story. And he came from all the way from over there all the way to the United States with his kid. And that's kind of one of those rare times that I've really made a main character, but that's because I had to explain, I wanted to explain the EDF's high command. And the EDF has a very interesting high command. So they have your standard generals and your standard leaders, but they also have a more strict code when it comes to following orders. To the point where they would rather send 1,000 troops in to save 10 civilians than let those 10 civilians die. This is how strict of a system that the EDF is. The EDF is well known for massacring its own troops in order to save civilians. Which does have some tension between the troops and the high command, because obviously if you're a soldier, your whole goal is to save civilians, but if you're going into somewhere and you know you're going to lose 90% of your unit, but you get to save 5 civilians, it does beg the question of whether or not it's worth it in the long run, because are those 5 civilians really going to produce enough more soldiers in the future to equivalent to that 1,000 or so, or 90% casualty rate? So it's very interesting the way they do things, but it works for quite a while. The EDF lasts for a couple of years, gets dismantled after some riots, because the EDF went through a really weird period where they went through a tyrannical period, is the best way to say it. Putting laws on what genders can do what roles, putting laws on how many kids a family can have, who can sleep with who, and they did a lot of race stuff. And then basically they were doing a whole bunch of craziness at the first time they really took control of a lot of the countries. In their defense, they were trying to figure out how to balance everything and how to make sure everything was as efficient as possible. But unfortunately, it came off as tyrannical. There was a lot of riots. We had some inner wars within the EDF. We had some anti-war, some pro-war groups that would actually steal nuclear warheads and launch them at cities, killing millions and millions and millions of people. And so the EDF was dismantled, and then obviously a couple years later, it was brought back as well. And the reformed version was much, much better, especially under the new command, and it kind of relaxed a lot of the pressure, and now most of the world is under EDF control and is pretty happy of it. But things in the Europe were rough. Places like Berlin, seeing hundreds of thousands of men wiped out in the first 30 seconds of a battle is rough. My main inspiration for the death counts was from World War I, because World War I has some of the most gruesome amount of death counts that you will ever see in a war in real life. World War I threw so many bodies at so many battlefields, or at the same battlefield sometimes, that it is an insane thing to comprehend. And that's what I wanted people to feel when they were reading this book. I wanted them to understand just how large of a battles these can be. Now in the story, I try to do my best to cover the battles in as much detail as possible without going into too much detail, because obviously some people don't want to just go into a 40-page chapter of just talking about the same battle. But that's something I really want to touch more on going forward, because I feel like a lot of my book has skimmed through a lot of battles a little too quickly. Maybe that's something I'll go back and I'll change later on, who knows. And I just feel like the vibe that I want people to get from these battles is not just the death, but the willingness to not give up. You're going to see this throughout the story a lot. There's a lot of times in these battles where you think people were just going to give up. You really did. And, like me and you probably would give up, right? We would probably give up so quickly it wouldn't even be funny. But these guys have been fighting for sometimes 20 years, right? Some of these dudes that are in these battles have been in more battles in a year than some of the, or if not all of the generations prior combined. So this is not something where, like, for example, you might have, say, a guy in Europe in World War II who went through, say, 5 or 6 battles, right, before he went home or, passed away or something. The guys in the EDF that were in Europe were fighting hundreds of battles a month. And they were serving for multiple years. So the terminology for, or the period of time that you would serve in the EDF depended on your age and if your line of duty. So if you were a private and you were in the early 20s or 30s, you would only spend about 2 years out on the field fighting. And if you survived those 2 years, you would come back for a couple months of R&R, and then you would go to officer training school and you would become an officer. And when you're an officer, you would oftentimes be stuck out in the battlefields for 3 to 4 to even 5 years. And if you're generals, a lot of these guys, these generals, don't even go home anymore. A lot of them don't even have homes back in the States because they never leave the battlefields. They're constantly in command of their armies. They're constantly moving. And so what happens a lot of times is there's actually a lot of single women back in the homelands from these soldiers because there's no one going home. When you go off to war in this time period, there's no going back for a majority of the command structure, right? Unless you're privates. And again, privates are oftentimes being the ones flung at the battles, so rarely, in rare cases, do a lot of these privates survive those 2-year periods. Usually by the end of the second year of your service, if you're still alive, you're already some of the best fighting troops on the planet by this point. And so it's very rare in most cases to see survivors come back. So a lot of times you'll see ships leave the States with new troops, and those ships will come back empty or with bodies. And so because of this long extended period of time in combat, it becomes very, very normal for people to become used to it. And so in Europe, it becomes so used to it, in fact, that a large majority of the men don't actually want to go home. And so you see this a lot of times where the privates, even the ones that survive the 2-year periods, could have the option to go back to home and do the training off, of course, for officer command. But a lot of these guys will actually vote to stay in the military for an additional period of time and just continue to serve as a private. So like, I think that's a really interesting idea that, like, when you're in the military, right, you can't wait to go home. A lot of these guys, right? A lot of the guys, like right now, for example, there's guys that are right now that are on ships in the U.S. Navy that are out for months and months and months, like 200 something days, and you can't wait to go home and hug your wife or your girlfriend or your daughters or your moms or whatever, right? And we're in a war where guys are in combat for so long they don't want to go home. There's no need to. And so, and again, these guys are being bred from a very early age in combat. The youngest you can possibly be before being drafted in the military is 16. When you hit 16, you are then able to be drafted into the EDF or the U.S. military at this point. So just think about it. If you're a 16-year-old watching this video, in this universe, you are now officially able to go into combat. And the combat for the average 16 to 27-year-old is about a 90% casualty rate. That is an insane amount of casualty rates. We're talking, if you're at a 1,000-man unit, at least 900 of you are going to die in a battle at any given point in time. And so this is a time period where men are bred for war, right? This is the Sparta of Earth in the future, right? This whole era is about being born into combat, and the you got like people like the children and the women back home are they're not hidden from war. They know what's happening. But the true scale of things back in Europe or in parts of the U.S. that are not inhabitable due to the war, places like Canada or even in Mexico or Australia, these places are not being shown on the news, right? So like in today's world, you can go on YouTube and you can find combat footage from Afghanistan. The news talks about people in Afghanistan. They talk about the wars, and they might not show us the graphic detail of it, but they can give us a kind of a good idea of what's happening over there, right? We can kind of get information. The back in the States or back in parts of Europe that are safe, there's very few places in Europe that are safe. But the places that are safe in Europe are places like the U.S., where a majority of civilians are stationed, especially the East Coast. A good majority of these people are not seeing the combat. They're seeing on the news, volunteer ads, like come sign up, fight for your country, fight for Earth, etc. Or they're seeing propaganda being pushed towards them. You're not actually seeing combat footage. You're not seeing that, and the places like social media is not nowhere near as strong as it is prior to the war. Obviously, because satellites aren't as useful anymore. The Exil took a lot of the satellites out when they initially assaulted Earth, and launching new satellites takes money, resources, and space. And unfortunately, that is not always possible. And so there's very few satellites. I think in today's age, there's like 900 satellites or something around the planet. During the era of this period, there's probably about maybe 30 satellites across the globe, and all of them are controlled by the military. And so what gets filtered in and out of social media is very, very high, right? Which is obviously kind of rough for the people at home because they have no idea what their kids or husbands or fathers or boyfriends or whatever are going through. But again, this is the time period these people live in, and this is the universe they have to deal with now. So Europe is kind of the weirdest battlefields of the future that you could probably think of, because they're old. They're old battlefields in a modern era. And what I mean by that is these are not battlefields like we see on the news today. Like you look at Ukraine or Israel, you have these city battlefields that are house-to-house combat, right? There is a lot of those battlefields, like say in like Los Angeles or in Berlin, but a large amount of these battlefields are actually happening in fields throughout Europe. A lot of the EDF is dug in hard in certain locations. FOBs or forward operating bases are everywhere. I think by the 2100s, there's around 13,000 FOBs located around Europe, spread throughout the fields, the deserts, the jungles, everything. And these FOBs basically hopscotch everywhere. So like if you're in one fob, you can be hopscotch to the next fob and so on and back and forth, right? And that way men are not getting too used to the surroundings. They're able to kind of move them around and need to be. And because of this, a lot of these fobs become the center focal points for battles, which is why there's so many battles happening every month and every year, because there's so many fobs, right? The ones that I mainly focused on in the story so far have been big city battles like Los Angeles, Miami, Detroit, etc., New York, because those are the ones that are probably the most vocal points, or the loudest vocal points for battles back home as well. A lot of civilians will know about the Battle of New York, the Battle of DC, the Battle of Berlin, the Battle of Moscow. They'll know about these battles more commonly, but they won't know about all the individual battles that are happening overseas. And a large majority of the battlefield deaths throughout the war will be coming from those small battles throughout the fields of Europe. And so these, like, you have to think about it like a trench warfare, right? It is just hell on earth for these guys overseas. Like they're just, it is the worst conditions possible. Majority of the infantry outside of the EDF's main ring of defense, which would be the United States, ammo, supplies, and food and water are all extremely infinite resource. So if you are an average soldier, you're lucky to get a gallon of water a month to drink for you. Some of these units were given 2 or 3 gallons for the entire unit for an entire month. And these units aren't what we call units today. These units are 300-400 guys each, so that's on average what would be inside of a fob. And these aren't small fobs either. These are quite large fobs in terms of how many men are inside them, right? But for the most part, physically, they're smaller. So you're putting 300 or 400 men inside of a very rough location, right? Usually these fobs are built on the edges of mountains, edge of ravines, or in valleys due to just logistical concerns. And so because of this, you're not drinking a whole lot of water, which is very important for your health. And the food outcome is depends on where you are. So if you're in the European side of, say, like France and Britain side of Europe, then you are going to do phenomenally well with food and water because of the oceans and because of the land that is hard, that is workable. But if you're in the Middle Eastern side of the European continent, so like near Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, that land is not as fertile, right? It is not as easily fertilized, I should say. So these guys in those areas are struggling a lot more. And so you have low food, low water. A lot of these guys don't have a lot of ammo. Most fobs have about 350 cals defending them with one mortar. And that's it for hundreds of square miles. Meanwhile, the Exil are coming every time they advance towards an American fob or an EDF fob, they are bringing multiple mortar teams, and the Exil mortars are some of the most accurate and deadly things in this entire war. The mortars become one of the most lethal weapons the humans have to deal with against the Exil. And when the Exil attack a fob, they're not just dropping 300 or 400 men, they're dropping like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 men, and they're pushing the fob all at once, immediately fast. And so these battles are just awful for the guys on the ground. But the biggest thing for the EDF is the air support situation, because the EDF has really good air support for the most part, especially in the later war. In early war, the F-22s, F-35s, F-14s, F-16s, F-18s, they were good, but the Exil fighters were so fast and so nimble, as well as the ability to cloak, so they would get up right behind them, uncloak and shoot, and it would be over before they knew it. Come to the later end of the war, the EDF felt more confident in the air-to-air combat, and you will see as battles go on in the future that the EDF is more able to withstand a lot of high pressure from the Exil due to the new increased air-to-air combat. And that's something that is kind of the leading point, right? That is, if whoever controls the air is going to control how the war plays out. At the beginning of the war, the Exil controlled the air, and so a lot of battles were lost because of this. But as the EDF's air support got better, the battles as a whole got a lot more easier to win. But with that being said, I'm coming up towards the end of the podcast here. My headset's about to die, so I'm going to make sure I get this in. I'm hoping that this is about 50 minutes. I've had to keep pausing because of a couple things. So hopefully the video is at the 50-minute mark or 55-minute mark. As I get better at this, we'll have better quality. I'm currently looking into ways to mitigate the car sounds from my window. Right now I have an AC in, so I think that might be causing the cars to be a little louder because it's technically the window's open. But I don't know. This is just one of those rooms that is loud for no reason, so maybe I'll have to record the podcast in a different room. Who knows? But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this first episode. Again, this episode's more just me describing something. As these episodes get into different topics. I will love to have guests on that can kind of give it a better, have more diverse conversations with going forward. The next podcast will be the 27th of October, so next Sunday, and that will be the first podcast after the release of Black Ops 6. So we talk about BO6 that podcast. Member videos daily and streams daily as well here on YouTube and on Twitch. If you are interested in joining the podcast as a guest, there'll be an application down below. If you want to be a co-host, just make sure you let me know in the actual application that you want to be the co-host, and I will put you into the co-host slot until, or at least the hat for pulling out people who want to be co-hosts. It would be nice to get one or two co-hosts in here. I think it'd be really cool to have a little squad of guys in here. So again, if you're interested, let me know down below. But thank you guys for watching the first episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I've always wanted to do a podcast, and so I'm really excited to kind of do one. I'm just hoping I get better at it as I go, which is kind of the best way to do it, honestly, is kind of just throw yourself into it and see how it goes. So with that being said, I love you guys. You're one of a kind, and I'll see you guys in the hot zone later.